Welcome to the Water Advocates third Thursday speaker series. I'm Brittany, and we welcome you to this event and thank you for joining us. The Water Advocates mission is to advocate for a balanced, equitable, and resilient water future for all New Mexico through public education and engagement and civic participation. The Water Advocates' main activism areas are located on the traditional homelands of the Southern Tiwa, pueblos of Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. Since time immemorial, we have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. We have some great workshops coming up for you for the rest of the season. In July, we are going to be welcoming two of our fabulous Bernalillo County Commissioners, Eric Olivas, who is the chair, and Frank Baca, who is a county commissioner. And they're going to be discussing building resilience in the Middle Rio Grande. So we really hope that you can join us for that. In August, we will be discussing watershed restoration, and we have some other upcoming program that we haven't quite finalized the details, but we will be getting those to you as soon as we possibly can. So again, we really hope that you can join us in July for this discussion with these Bernalillo County Commissioners. It's going to be a little bit of presentation, but a lot more of a discussion about how, as local government, we can build that resilience that we need to protect our water future. I'm going to post the registration link into the chat for you. If you go ahead and register, you'll be getting a reminder of that registration the day of the event. So you can put it in there and put it on your calendar, and then we'll also remind you because we know how busy summer times can be for everyone. And I'm going to now turn it over to Norm.
Thank you, Brittany. I wanted to just make a couple of substantive announcements that reflect our current situation, our situation today. I hope you're seeing the right version of the slide I'm sharing.
We are seeing kind of your presenter slide and next slide. So it's a very small there. That's the one we need to be seeing. Thank you.
As a retired water engineer, sometimes I just like to mess around with data. And I decided to look at the last 50 years of annual volumes that have flowed down the Rio Grande past the Otoe gauge, which is on the bridge to Los Alamos. It's a key gauge that is used to determine our compact delivery obligation to Elephant Butte. And I just want to summarize what this shows. First of all, the 50 years since 1975 plus the current year is 51 years. A third of 51 is 17. So I looked at the first 17 years, the middle 17 years, and the most recent 17 years. Most recently, in the last 17 years, the mean annual flow the mean annual volume is only 68% of what it was in the first third of these years. In the first third of these years, 10 of 17 years, the volume flowing past the Otoe gauge was over 1 million acre feet. In the most recent 17 years, we've had flows over 1 million acre feet only 4 times. And so that's one of the basic crises that we have to recognize. Our supply has dropped by hundreds of thousands of acre feet, but we're doing our best to keep our uses up. And the result, if you look at the compact history, is the graph on the left, and I've blown it up to show you what's going on now. And my announcement is that we had a 76,000 acre foot margin at the beginning of 2025, and we've used half of that up as of the end of May. And so this defines a crisis. We're very close to inviting Texas in to interfere and stick their noses into Middle Rio Grande water management because we're going to violate the compact. That concludes my announcement. And now to a more informative presentation, I want to introduce Maurice Hall. Maurice is a professional employee of the Environmental Defense Fund. And I really wasn't very familiar with the Environmental Defense Fund until they joined forces. They were represented by professional people in the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium from its beginning. Now, that's not Maurice's field. He has an entirely different field, but he is one of their true experts. He's an engineer, he has a PhD, and he knows his stuff. Thank you so much, Maurice, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Norm. I know some things for sure. Well, whether I live up to that or not is a good question. Are you able to see my presentation there?
Perfect.
Yes, it looks great.
Very good. Well, really, really appreciate the chance to be here. Thanks for joining this evening, and really appreciate Norm and Ralph asked me to present. I think Ralph saw a presentation of mine a couple of years ago, and so tonight I'll present a little bit of a variant of that presentation, hopefully with a little more specific information and thoughts about New Mexico, as I have lived here for a bit longer and beginning to learn. I certainly don't consider myself an expert on New Mexico groundwater yet, but I am striving to learn a lot and talking with a lot of sharp people and looking at some of the great data and information that's coming out of the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources on groundwater. So I'm going to talk, the title of my talk is Resilience from Below, Unlocking the Potential of the Natural Infrastructure of Aquifers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about aquifers and groundwater generally, and try to get a little bit of a message to you across of how we need to, I think, to do what we need to do in groundwater, how we need to think about it a little bit differently and communicate about it a little differently. And then I'll talk a little bit about an example of some of the things that have happened in California, where I've spent many years on a stump about groundwater. And then I'll try to come back to New Mexico and talk a little bit about what I see as the picture in New Mexico. Maybe a little bit just about me. I'm a water resources engineer, hydrologist or hydrogeologist. I've worked in now for many years in research and consulting, mostly consulting for water agencies, both municipal water agencies and irrigation districts and agricultural water agencies. And much of my background is in the realm of groundwater governance and management, and especially in areas where irrigated agriculture is a primary water user, and the use of water in agriculture is a big part of my background. And then for the last 15 years or so, I've been working in advocacy with the Nature Conservancy for a number of years, and for the last 9 years with Environmental Defense Fund. And I really see my job and our job in the water section of Environmental Defense Fund is really trying to build the multiple needs of water and people and nature into the way we manage our water every day. And I'll talk just a little bit more about that going forward. Environmental Defense Fund is a global climate organization, climate-focused organization. We work on climate mitigation, how to reduce emissions of the gases that cause climate change, and then how do we respond to it and build resilience and adapt to the changes that we see in climate change. Now, with respect to groundwater, I'm going to start in the Amargosa River. Now, the Amargosa River is in southeast California, just a few miles west of the Nevada border. And the reason I start here is it's one of the places where what I call the magic of groundwater just really hit me in the face. I was able to spend a lot of time here when I was working with the Nature Conservancy. And this is one of the most hostile, stark landscapes in the world. Summer temperatures frequently over 120 degrees, almost many years with no measurable precipitation. And yet, this little river flows year-round, day in and day out, through the Amargosa Canyon. And the reason it does is because of the magic of groundwater. Water falls on the desert in Nevada and upstream in Nevada and California, upstream of the Amargosa River, but fairly little precipitation. But over a huge area, some areas as far as 100 miles away in the peaks of the Charleston Mountains, northwest of Las Vegas, and that water seeps into the ground, and various aquifers collect that and store it and move that water very slowly to a number of discharge points. And so right here at the Amargosa Canyon, just near Tacoma, California, those collected waters emerge from different aquifers. And because of the geologic constrictions here in this canyon, that water collected over hundreds of thousands of acres flows down through the Amargosa Canyon and maintains this amazing ribbon of green in an otherwise practically unvegetated landscape. If you get the chance to visit there, I encourage you to do that. But more importantly, I want all of you to think about places in New Mexico where the magic of groundwater emerges for you. And I've been exploring some of those areas, and I look forward to finding those and being able to talk with you about those in the future, because it really is special, the different things that groundwater does to make sure that water shows up day in and day out to amazing places like the Amargosa River and to the wells from which we withdraw much of the water that sustains us here in New Mexico. So a little more into that magic of groundwater aquifers. Here, I developed this diagram as a sort of hypothetical groundwater basin. This one, in this case, it's a basin that shows a river and the underlying geology. But I want to make the case that magic and the capacity of groundwater is really underutilized the way we generally use groundwater and manage groundwater. And so my talk is really about how do we preserve that magic and leverage it for the benefit of all the groundwater users. And that includes people who pump groundwater to irrigate crops, or for drinking water, and for household uses, or for cities. And it also includes the ecosystems and the rivers and streams that depend on groundwater. I kind of went over this in my introduction, so I'll skip that quickly. But the issue of groundwater aquifers being underutilized is related to how we've managed groundwater in the past. And our management of groundwater has really been pretty passive in most cases. Now we've woken up in some cases, and we're beginning to do things differently in some cases, including some great examples in New Mexico. But we tend to kind of wait till something's wrong, and then we try to address it in groundwater management. So reacting to some problem, either a contamination that arises at one of our wells, or maybe our well starts to go dry, and then we start to get involved and start to think about this amazing resource that has just magically shown up in our wells. And along with that, we've really under-monitored and underfunded groundwater management writ large across the West, including in New Mexico, but practically all the states in the Western U.S. are guilty of that. And the status of this groundwater management is not where it really needs to be almost anywhere across the West. Now, I think one of the keys to unlocking this magic and to advocating and making the case for the more proactive groundwater management that we need is to begin to think about our groundwater basins, those aquifers from which our groundwater comes, as infrastructure, as its natural infrastructure. We didn't build it, true, but we take advantage of it every day, and we need to manage it for that value that it brings. And to dig into that a little bit more, let's just look at a hypothetical cross-section in this hypothetical aquifer and talk about some of the things that this magic infrastructure does for us. So this is an example of an aquifer in a location that's adjacent to a river. Aquifers look different and have different settings, but this is not unlike what you might see along the Rio Grande in the middle reaches of the Rio Grande, or maybe along the Pecos, or in a smaller version along the Gila, sections of the Gila. But it's an alluvial aquifer where there's groundwater in the sediments in the alluvial valley. There's some hills on one side that are more impermeable rock. Maybe there's some rock water flowing through it, and there's a river flowing across it. Now let's just think about what this aquifer does. So this aquifer collects water from a range of sources. A little bit of water comes down as precipitation. Some of it sinks into the soil. It sits in the soil. Some of it evaporates, but some goes on down to the aquifer and recharges that aquifer. The aquifer collects that and stores it there. It also might collect water from some of the inflows from the mountains to the side, to the west in this case, or to the left, I guess, in this case, and may get intermittent flows that come out of some of those arroyos, and that sinks into the aquifer and becomes part of that aquifer water that's stored. And water comes in from surrounding aquifers and the river that's flowing across the groundwater. If the groundwater levels are lower than the levels in the river, the water comes from the river and recharges the aquifer. And the aquifer collects all this water and holds it. It does a lot of other things. It collects that water, as I said. It stores it. And unlike surface reservoirs, it stores it with almost no evaporative losses, except where the groundwater might be really close to the surface and some phreatophytic vegetation can tap it. So it holds that water for long periods of time. And importantly, the upper layers of that aquifer, the soil layers, really act as a giant bioreactor. And so water of all types might come into it from arroyos, from recharge, from irrigation areas. And that water is of highly variable quality, but that upper layers of the aquifer where the infiltration takes place treats that water, filters it, treats it. And in many cases, the aquifer water is really high quality, partly due to that filtration and treatment of the recharge. It also serves as a conveyance mechanism. We basically poke wells into the aquifer. We pump the water out of the well so that the water level in the well goes down, and the water from the surrounding aquifer flows into that well. And so magically, that water that's coming from all different types of sources dispersed over the landscape shows up in our wells. And we poke those wells in and pump that water. And we've done that through the years, in many cases with very little thought about where the water comes from and how much is there and how long it's going to last. Also importantly, that aquifer can provide habitat support for these groundwater dependent wetlands, the bosque that's prevalent along sections of the Rio Grande, other areas where the groundwater levels rise to the surface. You get springs and seeps and groundwater dependent vegetation. And it also supports stream flow. When aquifer levels are higher, which they tend to be under natural conditions, that water will provide some of the stream flow, and therefore streams can flow long after the rains have passed into the drier seasons for long periods of time because of that continued aquifer inflow. So that's a lot of things that aquifer is doing for us, and it continues to do it day in and day out, and yet we tend not to really think about it as part of the infrastructure. Now I'm going to talk about a topic, a term that I use pretty frequently, and this is resilience. It's become a term that we use pretty frequently, and I think it's a really valuable term. This is my definition of resilience. A lot of different people have a different version of resilience, but I think it is the capacity of systems to support human and natural well-being as climate change and other stressors interact unpredictably over time. And I've got this little dial that I call my resilience meter, and I'll use it in different places just to sort of symbolize where we are in the resilience spectrum. On the far left side of that, we're on the edge. We're not really paying attention. And as a result, we're not able to respond to disruptions or anticipate disruptions and plan for things in the future. And on the far right is a sophisticated management that anticipates future conditions, future possibilities, and is taking actions to make sure that we don't get to crisis situations or severe disruptions. And in the case of managing for resilience, in the case of water supply, I tend to sort of boil it down to a few things. First of all, you anticipate change. Things are not always going to be as they are. And you plan using the best available knowledge to deal with that change and avoid those harmful disruptions that can really be problematic for families, for industry, for agriculture, for ecosystems. You plan so that you don't get to that precipice and get pushed off of it. And importantly, a little adjustment in the way of thinking about it, you want to identify, in the case of groundwater, what are the services that you want to preserve? What are the different functions that groundwater aquifer and the water in it provides? And what do you want to preserve of that? And how do you protect them? It's not just about how much water can we pump. Frequently, that's one of the first questions you'll get answered about groundwater when you're talking with decision makers or water managers. How much water do we have? How much water can we pump? Well, it's much more than that. It's really about looking at all the different functions that aquifer provides, deciding, okay, which of these do we want to try and protect and preserve and continue into the future? And then, what are the groundwater levels that we need to protect those functions? And so too often, these functions might include a domestic well, a well for irrigation, might include some groundwater dependent wetlands, either up on the uplands or along the river corridors. It might include protecting a certain amount of stream flow. But these are functions that this aquifer provides. And too often what we've done is we've drilled the wells, we've started pumping, and we drill a few more wells, we pump those, and slowly these functions disappear. And I'm telling you, this has happened innumerable times across the West, and you end up not realizing what you got until it's gone, and it's difficult to recover. And we've pumped many of our groundwater aquifers to the point where associated streams or interconnected streams that might used to have run all year long or run most of the year now only run for shorter periods of time, and in many cases they're completely dry and almost never run except immediately after storms. And so the sooner we can start looking more at this as infrastructure and how we manage and operate that infrastructure to preserve the functions that it provides, the more of those functions we're going to be able to preserve and protect into the future. So what are some of the tools that we actually use to manage for groundwater resilience? Just want to run through a few of these quickly so that you kind of get in your mind the types of things that proactive groundwater management includes. I think one of the more important tools is engaging the community. Too often our water decisions have been made by one or two of the water users that are most prominent, often have a big economic interest in that water. And other users, the ones that use some of those other benefits, like their domestic well, for instance, maybe the ecosystems or the stream flows, are not present in that decision making. So in community engagement allows us to get all of the services on the table so we can have a clear discussion about what all we want to support. And that transparency and information exchange is critical in the long term to getting the accountability in the right places and building political durability for the actions and the management schemes that you put in place. Another important tool for managing for resilience is data and information. You need to know what the situation is. I think that's self-explanatory. And in the case of groundwater, that means groundwater levels, ideally from dedicated monitoring wells, so they're not disrupted by the pumping of the wells. But any data is better than no data. The well logs allow us to characterize the aquifer and understand the porosity, how easily water is going to move through it, which parts of the aquifer are permeable, which parts are not. It's important to know how much water is withdrawn. Often we have very little information about this, but some parts of New Mexico, we have metering in place. And across the West, that's a real challenge, is how do you know and how do you get good information on the amount of water that's withdrawn? Evapotranspiration is another piece of information that's really important. Some of you have heard me talk about OpenET, which is a tool that we helped develop with NASA to make evapotranspiration data more accessible to a wider range of users. And basically, that's the amount of water that leaves the land surface and the vegetation and goes back to the atmosphere. And it's really important in determining how much groundwater recharge you have and how much water is being used by some of those applications. Other tools for managing resilience include geologic interpretation, groundwater modeling, and other forms of integrated water modeling, budget development and tracking, so that different participants and different users of water know where they are with respect to their allocation and how those allocations add up to the total water budget in the aquifer. And when you get to the more sophisticated management, you can begin doing scenario development. So you can anticipate what if, and then use your model to explain what might happen and give you insights on what might happen if new pumping occurs, if temperatures rise, if we divert water in a different way to our irrigation area, etc. Those are really important tools for the more sophisticated water management. Oops. Another tool that we like to talk about is managed recharge, which is a really valuable tool when water is available from other sources to deliberately increase the amount of water that's going into the aquifer. And that can be through stream bed recharge. It can be through dedicated recharge basins. And in some unique circumstances, even direct injection through wells can be a way of doing this. If you're going to do things like this, though, it requires investment. And anytime you're going to make a pretty significant investment, you need to have confidence that that investment is going to yield the benefits that you're paying for. And so you need improved accounting systems. You need cooperations between people and entities that may not be used to cooperating, surface and groundwater users, municipal and agricultural users, environmental advocates and water users, etc. And you're going to have to accept some of those inefficiencies and be transparent about and reality about those. There's a whole range of multi-benefit projects, and would love to dive into any of those in our question and answers that you have questions about, because we've helped implement some, and I've definitely helped design some and steer and fund some of those. But anytime you're going to make investment for collaborative projects, you're going to need these more advanced accounting systems, and you're going to have to get cooperation from the different participants that are needed. So in setting the stage for groundwater resilience, there's some fundamentals. And I'm going to present here a kind of a quick outline of a framework that we've developed at Environmental Defense Fund for climate resilient, sustainable groundwater management. This is built out of our experience both on the ground in different states in the West, but also bringing in the experience of other experts. What is it you really need if you want to do a good job of groundwater management? And we come down to 4 basic categories of things. The first is information and understanding, fundamental. Then someone needs to be watching the ship. You need some entity who sees themselves as responsible for this, and they have to have the right authorities, etc. You need some sort of a management framework that sets out what you're trying to accomplish. And importantly, you need engagement of the broader community, the beneficiaries, and the people who have stake in the way that groundwater is managed in this decision making. So in the case of information and understanding, transparent and accessible information on aquifers and their condition, including data on the groundwater level, production, and quality. And then, of course, there's different sophistication levels beyond that, the modeling and the detailed monitoring, scenario playing, etc. And with respect to the authority, someone who feels like it's their responsibility, they're empowered, they have the right authorities, they know what guardrails they have to manage within, and they have the resources they need to do the job that's in front of them. I switched those other on the slide. Sorry, mistake on the slides. With respect to community engagement and decision making, transparency, communities being involved in that decision making is going to ensure that, one, you have all the benefits mapped out and you have those voices present, and you want to increase the durability of the solutions and the practices that you put in place. And then in the case of the management framework, you really need a shared understanding around the access, who has access to what, the water quality and monitoring, enforcement, and ideally some incentives to help motivate actors to do what is needed for the collective good. So that's just just a basic framework of what more advanced groundwater management looks like. And now I want to spend a few moments on an example of where a big transition is taking place. And Norm, I see you showed up. I didn't know if you had a note for me or, okay on time so far. And this is in California. And this is a situation I like to talk about, partly because I was involved in it, very intimate with it, partly because it's an example of what can happen when there is a collective motivation built, and in response, again, to unique circumstances, which was, in this case, another drought, the drought of 2011 to 2014 in California, that really drove action, where most of California's aquifers before that time, before 2014, they were really actively managed at all. Now, there were some notable exceptions to that. Some of the best examples of sophisticated groundwater management are in California and in Southern California, usually where someone sued someone else at some point, and there had to be a settlement. And so institutions were put in place to manage that groundwater. But across most of the state, particularly the heavily pumped areas for irrigated agriculture, were managed. It was kind of the wild, wild west. You got a permit to drill a well, but there weren't very much limitations on that. And as a result, you've probably heard of some of the real severe problems that were happening, particularly in the Central Valley aquifers, but also in many of these aquifers along the coast here, Salinas Valley, Santa Maria Valley, huge areas of saltwater intrusion, where because the aquifer levels were lowered, saline water from the ocean was coming into the groundwater and disrupting water quality. Subsidence. There were areas in the southern Central Valley where we had subsidence back in the 70s. Everyone thought it was over, but in 2013, there were areas that dropped 6 inches to a foot in the year. It was amazing. So there was a lot of motivation, a lot of recognition that something needed to change. And as a result, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, widely thought of as the biggest advancement in Western water law in probably 100 years. Over the opposition of some, but generally with a pretty broad agreement that something needed to happen. I've got some statistics here on California water use just to give you a sense of that the total annual water use in California is something on the order of 40 million acre feet. About 80% of that is for irrigation of agriculture. Even in a state with cities the size of LA and San Diego, irrigated agriculture is still 80% of the water use. And really about 50% of it is groundwater. And that number changes year to year. And in fact, it's crept up in recent decades. But big fraction of that water is groundwater. And I think before 2014, California's groundwater resilience was really pretty far over to the left. SGMA passed in 2014. And basically what SGMA does is requires management of 127 priority basins. Now, actually, that number has been changed since then because one of the requirements of SGMA was the Department of Water Resources needed to update the prioritization of basins, and they have now done that. So that number has changed a bit. But that's what the colors on this map show. The yellow and orange basins are designated as high and medium priority basins, and all of those had to be brought under management under SGMA. And a focus of SGMA was local control. And I frankly think that's the best option. Local control. Things are different, unique circumstances, but with some boundaries and some requirements. Those local entities, local areas had to form a sustainability agency, Groundwater Sustainability Agency, GSA, the focus of all the effort of SGMA, Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. They have to develop a plan for sustainability. And that plan really has to show how they're going to avoid 6 undesirable results. And those are things like saltwater intrusion, significant and continued depletion of groundwater storage, subsidence, water quality degradation, and surface water depletion, increased surface water depletion. And so locals, we're not going to tell you exactly how you have to do this, but you have to meet some basic requirements, and you have to get your ship in order, get someone in place to actually do the job and have the authority and the responsibility, and then avoid these undesirable results. I'm really thankful to say that now there are groundwater sustainability agencies established across all these areas. The first suite of plans was approved. Some were actually disapproved now 2 years ago. Second suite of plan have just been recently submitted. And most important, now, every day in California, literally thousands of people get up and their job, they go to work and their job is to manage their groundwater. That may seem like a huge investment, but the economic value of that and the social value of that and the environmental value of that is enormous. And so now the investments are being made. And while SGMA was actually a fairly passive law in its basic structure, it says, don't let these bad things happen. Once you have that authority in place and you provide them with resources and information, now some really interesting things can start happening, and they are. The state of California, frankly, right now, is the biggest groundwater management experiment that's happened in the world. Thousands of people with lots of investment. I should look up the dollars, just the state dollars that have gone into it, but I'm sure it's into the multiple hundreds of millions of dollars at this point, are now really unlocking this magic of groundwater and this amazing infrastructure that the state has depended on up to this point, but really hasn't proactively managed over much of the state. And so now these people, these groundwater sustainability agencies, their staff and their consultants, and the state around them with resources and expertise is managing this natural infrastructure to protect drinking water supply, protect stream flows, protect agricultural supplies in balance with the water that's available, and sustaining the cities and the farms of California. Now let's come back to New Mexico. And I want to emphasize that, again, I am still just learning New Mexico. I moved here 4 years ago, and I'm immersing myself to the extent my bandwidth allows and learning about this amazing place. And so these are my opinions, somewhat informed opinions, but there are people on this call that know more about any of these topics than I do. And so I want to continue to learn from them. But this image comes from the what we call the look-ahead report. And for a hydrologist who's been studying evapotranspiration for a long time, this says worlds to me. Even if you want to argue about whether we're going to have bigger monsoons or whether we're going to have more wet winter precipitation and snowpack or less, irrespective of that, which there is a fair bit of uncertainty in, the temperature is going up. And for every click up in temperature, every square piece of land and every tree and every vegetated area is going to use more water. So every area of forest in our headwaters is going to transpire more water. Every irrigated acre is going to require more water to meet the same yields with the same crops. Every piece of rangeland and grassland that is providing some of that recharge to that underlying aquifer, there's going to be more of the bigger fraction of the precipitation goes back up in evapotranspiration, and that's going to mean less recharge to groundwater, less runoff to our streams, which also is a source of groundwater recharge. And so this is not good news for the water supply in New Mexico. So with that, just that underpinning, there's a lot of details. That was a great report. If you haven't taken a look at that report, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's very, very well done and insightful. So with all of that in mind, what's the state of New Mexico's groundwater today? Just a few thoughts from my early understanding. And this is coming more into focus for me. I'm participating with a group we're loosely organized called the Groundwater Alliance, and we're hoping to issue a report in a few weeks or a month or so that will provide more details on this. But New Mexico is the most groundwater dependent state of all the Western states. It's a little hard to believe when you think about when you drive across Nevada, but Nevada, a big fraction of Nevada's water supply comes from the east side of Sierras and from the Colorado River. But it's the most groundwater dependent state. We have something like 577 community water systems. 550 of those depend exclusively on groundwater. If you get away from the Albuquerque, Santa Fe region and off of the main corridors of the rivers, practically all the communities depend on groundwater. Now, those community water systems have many urgent infrastructure needs, and it's been really rewarding to see the investments and the attention on those in recent years, including in the legislature. Those are urgent. They're important. But most of those efforts are focused on the traditional infrastructure, the pumps and the pipes, the wells, and the distribution system, in some cases, treatment systems. Fairly little focus on that natural infrastructure that brings the water to those wells. So we need to change that. When I think of these community water systems, and I've had conversations with them, and this is the case that I'm getting is you've got, in many cases, volunteer boards, maybe a few paid staff, maybe no paid staff, and they're trying to make sure that their pump works and their pipelines don't leak and all their water doesn't leak out and they don't have blowouts and disrupt their water supply. And then they've got this nagging thought in the back of their head, our groundwater levels have kind of been going down, but we haven't really had the capacity to pay attention to that yet. So we need to change that because the pumps don't work and the pipes don't work if there's no water in the aquifer. So a little bit more about groundwater today in New Mexico. And I'm comparing it now to that framework that I described earlier. There's 4 items, if you remember. The first is information and understanding. And in the case of information and understanding in New Mexico, we have some really big data gaps in aquifer characterization and the condition tracking in much of the state. Underlined much of the state, because there are some notable exceptions to that, but in much of the state, that's the case. The information we do have suggests that in those aquifers, I call them isolated aquifers, but those aquifers that aren't closely tied to a perennial river system. So those isolated aquifers are slow declines in many of those aquifers and urgent declines in some of them, really urgent declines, particularly in the high plains regions. Now, good news is that some really ambitious and exciting progress is being made in understanding our aquifers and the trajectory and conditions of them, particularly in the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, aquifer mapping, and water data programs. And I'm really impressed at the sophistication of that effort, the great planning that's gone into it, and the execution, and thankfully, increased funding in recent years from the legislature for that effort. Making great strides, lots of holes to fill in, but we're working diligently to fill in those holes, and we need to continue and accelerate that. And it's also important to highlight that there are some notable bright spots. So we have examples in New Mexico where we know what the situation is and where we're going pretty well. And I highlight a couple of these that I'm reasonably familiar with. Pecos Valley Artesian Conservation District, the Rio Grande alluvial aquifer along in the vicinity of Albuquerque, where some really interesting work has happened in the last couple of decades. And we're making rapid progress on understanding the lower Rio Grande, in part driven by the Interstate Compact dialogue there. The next step in that groundwater framework is a responsible management authority. So in New Mexico, the Office of the State Engineer and I guess stepping back for a moment, the state does have authority for groundwater management. And if they either need to do that or they need to delegate that authority. And in many cases, delegating that authority is what states have chosen to do. The Office of the State Engineer has some authorities and tools. Most of those are passive. And exercising the more active parts of it are really challenging because it's politically difficult to do some of the hard things. Now, there are some notable bright spots again. It's really interesting to see what the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservation District has done. Notably, that is in part due to drivers of an interstate compact many years ago that caused that unique situation to develop, but really good example for what could happen in other parts of the state. And again, Rio Grande alluvial aquifer around Albuquerque. And an important lesson for us is what's going on with the Ogallala Land and Water Conservation District. And LaDonna Clayton and some of the amazing leaders there have really stepped up and taken authority into their own hands and moved forward in doing some amazing things. And we really need to, getting into my recommendation, so to speak, but we really need to make it easier and facilitate things like that happening without having to have an interstate compact or a crisis on your hands. In most regions, we have fairly limited local authorities present and very limited resources and investment to support those authorities, even if they did exist. So the third part of that framework, or that framework, is having a management framework. Again, the Office of State Engineer has some piecemeal tools. There are some bright spots, but generally we have a fairly limited structure and plan in most areas. In some cases, specific actions might be being taken, but those actions are really going to be most successful if they're in the context of a more holistic management framework with objectives, with public buy-in, with community buy-in, and with the resources to actually do take some of those hard steps. And in those isolated aquifers, what that lack of active frameworks mean is that it's really a default to an unplanned depletion. And that can only continue for so long because there's only so much water and only so much recharge. In the cases of the stream-connected aquifers, what the lack of active management does is it means there's an overdependence, a default to an overdependence on surface water depletion to achieve the aquifer balance. What that means is the aquifer levels may not necessarily be going down, but they're not going down because they're taking water from the surface water, and that affects how much water is in the stream for the fish and wildlife and for other benefits, and how much water is available downstream. The last point I'll make in this is related to that fourth part of the groundwater management framework that we put together, and that is community engagement and decision-making. Again, some notable bright spots. In many cases, there's just a fairly low level of awareness and engagement, particularly on groundwater in many of the regions. I think the regional planning process offers a great start, and go ISC and regional teams, I'm certainly a huge fan, and I think we should be huge fans of that process and those investments. And we need to work on how to resolve the uncertainty of how proactive groundwater management fits into the overall picture of regional planning and water management. So what will it take to go to the next level, to click that resilience knob up for New Mexico groundwater? And this is Maurice's short list, although I started it and it turned out to be not so short. And it's not so much of a, sort of a plan of what the state needs to do, but things that are needed that we need to think about for New Mexico's groundwater resilience to really take hold. First of all, top of the list, no doubt, we need sustained investment in aquifer understanding. The mapping and monitoring program, better information on withdrawals. We have some metering in some areas of the state, and other areas of the state, we have very little information on withdrawals. Some of that we can fill in some of the information gap with things on about information on evapotranspiration, et cetera, but we really need that better information on withdrawals. And this will feed into more sophisticated tools like groundwater management, groundwater models, et cetera. Second, someone needs to be watching the ship. We need empowered local authorities that have a charge, a mandate, and the authorities to execute on that mandate. And importantly, the information and resources to know what corrective actions to take. The rest of this list is less concrete, but we really need to have a dialogue about how to provide clear information to all the participants. We need local leadership. We need to empower that, and we need state support on an ongoing basis in resources and expertise to back those local leaders up. And it's going to require unprecedented cooperation among groundwater managers where they exist and where they don't. We need them. Pueblos, tribes, and nations, the sovereign entities need to be part of the dialogue because groundwater management doesn't stop at boundaries and affects all of us. Surface water users inevitably are being impacted by groundwater management and can be part of the solution to building more sophisticated resilience in groundwater. Environmental interest, agricultural producers, reservoir operators, state and federal agencies. Basically, we need all hands on deck, and we need an air of and an attitude and a facilitated cooperation for that. With that in place, we can share innovation. That's something that Environmental Defense Fund can really help with. It's part of what we're doing in California and in Arizona and Oregon, sharing resources, lessons from other places and tools, and helping to build tools and fund tools that don't exist. And importantly, it's going to require trust. So in conclusion, I just want to really emphasize the urgency of this. And LaDonna Clayton is certainly a much more articulate spokesperson on this topic, speaking from the heart and from the bullseye of groundwater scarcity challenges in New Mexico. It is a crisis there, and we need to do all we can to help surround that community with LaDonna and the leadership of others that are just amazing leaders around her, bring the resources and bring the attention to that place. And as we do that, we need to very quickly learn and pilot ways of addressing the situation that can be deployed in other parts of New Mexico. Because while there are not so many evident crises, there are, I am convinced, many slowly emerging situations that are really problematic and will become crises if they're not addressed. Maybe it's years before they become crises, but my sense is that there are probably some that are months away rather than decades away. And we need to begin putting in place the infrastructure and institutions to manage this natural infrastructure across the state before we get to the point of a crisis. So thank you, and I'll leave you with this image of the Amargosa in hopes that all of you will begin to think a little more about the magic of groundwater in and around you here in the land of enchantment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. That was very educational. I definitely learned a lot, and I appreciate the information. we have a few questions to answer or to ask you, sorry, for you to answer, for me to ask and for you to answer. Given our small rural population and cost of DPR, what is the best path forward for ensuring as much of our water stays in the community? What extent can wastewater reuse be used in our smaller communities, even assuming adequate, realistic funding for that?
So I'll respond to the last part of the question, and then I might need to ask you, Brittany, to repeat the first part. But with respect to reuse of treated wastewater, we need to account for that, and it is a very valuable resource. It has been misinformation about it has been an impediment to direct potable reuse, as someone put in the chat, and even indirect potable reuse. It's an important source of water, and we need to account for it, and it could be a valuable tool to use in particular situations, but we also need to remember that that treated wastewater is already going somewhere. And so if we use it for something different, we need to make sure we're accounting for where that water went before and make sure we're not just robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so can be a valuable tool, and the right accounting around it is needed to make sure that we're not double counting a water supply that we're already using somewhere else. Could you repeat the first part of the question?
Yes, absolutely. Given our small rural populations and the cost of direct potable reuse, what is the best path forward for ensuring as much of our water stays in the community?
I think I answered some of that, and really the key issue is unless water evaporates, it goes somewhere. And so we need to be careful about the accounting as we change how we're using a particular water stream. And so wastewater that generated in a particular community might be part of what's meeting the interstate compact, for instance, because it's being discharged into a river and becomes a flow somewhere else. So we need to be aware of that accounting and make those decisions with clear-eyed view of what the trade-offs are.
Thank you. There's a follow-up to that, and April, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question, so if I misrepresent it, please go ahead and unmute yourself and correct me. Does it make the most sense for septic systems to be on the land where water is extracted from wells, such as in the Sandia Heights community northeast of Albuquerque?
Very interesting. I did a pretty extensive evaluation of septic systems as potential contaminant sources in this case, it was on the alluvial aquifer along the South Platte River in northeastern Colorado. And so I looked a lot at the literature on the performance of septic tanks. And in reality, well-functioning septic tanks do a pretty good job. And so it shouldn't necessarily be scary to, if you understand that septic tanks are overlying your water supply, your groundwater supply, like they are for me here in Santa Fe County. And poorly functioning septic tanks are a source of contamination. And therefore, we need to make sure that septic tank maintenance is maintained and put the right resources toward that. Now, I recognize that in many of as we talk about different issues, I will recommend things that cost money that are not necessarily being paid for at the moment. And unfortunately, that's really the case. And that is that our water resources, like I've been describing, are part of our We need them. We've got to have them. And they deserve the investment that is required. And if we're not making that investment, we probably need to. And we need to figure out how to fund it.
Thank you. April clarified for me that she meant that septics were a good example of returning water to where it came from when it's a closed system, or those are the kind of the closed aquifer areas, just as a point of clarification. I wanted to ask you, from your experience in California, I find that a lot of times in New Mexico, there's not much understanding of how much of a crisis is we're already in and how quickly the precipice is coming. And we do have a lot of work to do in our legislature to get funding for our water resources and protecting it and doing all of the amazing, that framework that you set out. How would you recommend that we talk to our legislators, to the public in general, to educate them before the crisis happens? It's very clear when your well grows dry that there's a problem. But before that happens, I think people may not be aware of the upcoming issues that we're going to be facing.
Yeah, a really good question. And I'm sure my response will be um, somewhat unfulfilling, but hopefully helpful. Um, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the aquifer mapping and monitoring program at New Mexico Tech. And that was a big focus for us in the last legislative session to try and ensure that that was funded adequately. And we we also need to build local capacities for better monitoring and interpretation of what the monitoring information is telling us. And um, again, that takes capacity that in many cases doesn't exist. And I think it's actually a good prompt for me to think about in our work is how to very quickly and inexpensively tell the stories that limited data is telling us. While we're trying to build the monitoring network out, both at a local level and through programs like the centralized work at New Mexico Tech. But even a little bit of data usually tells you things that are really important. Maybe not with the confidence that you want to have, but when it's all you have and it's critically important, we need to be able to tell data from that story. So, uh, a pretty unsatisfactory or unfulfilling answer, but um, I'll work on that myself. That's something I can do.
No, I think that was a great answer. And I think that, kind of leads me to an ask for the community, and that we all need to really push our elected officials to make this a priority and to figure out how to communicate with them so that that funding does happen. I know that the funding this year for that aquifer program, you got some of it, but not it probably nearly as much as was needed. And I do know that we need a lot more for the state engineer and the NMED and the other agencies that are working on the other components of this process. So then that leads me to the next question is how do you, in your experience in California, what was the best way to get all of these different local entities and overarching government entities into the same room to kind of work together to solve this problem, instead of working on their own individual pieces and then coming together? It sounds to me like there was a lot more collaborative process than I'm seeing in New Mexico at the moment.
Yes, this is I think this is the real key to making big change and changing direction, and to the earlier questions, making the case for the resources that are really needed to appropriately manage our water. Um, and most importantly, there needs to be conversations between the interests. I spent in the lead up to Sigma, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act California, I spent a big fraction of my time doing two things. One was articulating in different ways and doing the research that was needed to clarify how groundwater and surface water are connected, so that then I could make the case to those surface water users that groundwater management and improvements in groundwater management were needed. The second thing I spent a lot of time in was, even though I worked for an environmental organization, I talked more to farmers and the agricultural community for a period of about 3 years than I did to the environmental community. And it was very enlightening to better understand what worried them and what might actually work for them that I might not have thought would work for them, and how inventive the agricultural community was in getting things done and coming up with ideas when they were given clear information about what the situation was. And so that basically just is a lesson that sitting in our silos is not going to get the job done. And the more we can communicate across our traditional kind of comfort discussions, the better solutions we're going to come up with. And where we can find common ground, that is where the legislature will respond.
Mhm.
If we can come to the legislature with proposals where an environmental community member like me and Pueblo representatives and agricultural representatives and city water managers and community service district board members are saying, we want this and we agree on this, that will resonate and we'll get some action done. And that's exactly what we at Environmental Defense Fund hope to do in the realm of groundwater management, is to not necessarily say, here are the answers, but to talk with a lot of different entities to develop the right answers for New Mexico in the realm of groundwater resilience.
Thank you so much. Would you speak to the need to fund the OSE, the Office of the State Engineer, to clean up, expand, and make their data available so that we can figure out what there is and what we're using? I think there's this, big disconnect between what's been permitted and what's actually available in wet water.
Yeah, and although it may seem like we're a bit archaic, the same situation exists across most of the states, and most states are scrambling to try and fill in those information gaps and begin to assemble this information. There's a lot of work going on in Arizona, for instance, that we're engaged in, and Colorado, although they're one of the more advanced states, certainly one of the more advanced states with respect to groundwater management, they still have information gaps. But absolutely. My understanding is that a number of years ago, there was quite a kind of a pullback and reduction in funding for state agencies that were involved in water management. We've begun to rebuild that to some degree, and there could be a sense in the legislature that, hey, we've invested these dollars in the last few years, and so aren't we finished? It's absolutely important that we continue to increase that investment and build those capacities, and for us in the community to help make the case for the legislature that this is not a project that we can fund and be done with. This is an ongoing enterprise that is needed, as it is always needed, to manage and manage infrastructure the way built infrastructure is managed. We have to make a continued investment and eventually bring that consistent investment up to the level that it needs to be for the long-term good of the state.
Thank you. Do you think a public marketing campaign from an organization such as the ISC or from New Mexico Water Advocates, this group, would be effective at, bringing the word out about what the status is of our local water resources? Maybe something like billboards or on highways.
I think the communication about this is absolutely essential. And I think it takes all of us. There are certain things that the ISC and the OSE can say with authority that no one else can say with authority. And there are things they can't say that we can. And we very much need to work together to do the communication that's necessary. I could identify a few things that I think would be really valuable, but I think more importantly, kind of following on the example of the Water Can't Wait campaign that was, I thought, very helpful in raising the level of awareness, building on that in social media, in paid advertisements, and in communications like this forum and similar forums. We really do need to get this word out, and it needs to come from all of us. Different legislators have an ear for different interests, and if we can have an aligned message from different perspectives, it's going to have a bigger impact.
Thank you so much. I think that was the last of our questions, unless anyone else had something that they didn't get answered.
And I'll just add, while others are contemplating other questions, I'll add one final point to that. We at EDF are very much planning to do some coordinated communication work around the need for groundwater management. We'll be doing some outreach to different parts of the continuing and expanding outreach. We just hired a new staff person here in New Mexico to lead this effort. And her name is Gretel Fullingstad, and she's here in Santa Fe. And so many of you will probably be hearing from Gretel in the coming months. So we're going to be upping our game in communication. And for any of you here on this call who have interest in that and would like to talk to us about how we can collaborate, that would be welcome news for us.
Thank you so much. I see Norm posted one last question. What did it take in California to convince legislators and water agency executives to delegate and share power to get things done?
There were a few different factors that were prominent in this, and I have talked about this in different forums and different settings, and it's really fun to kind of think about it again. But absolutely, the drought was a big driver. The images that came out around the drought of really low reservoir levels, irrigation ditches that could no longer carry their amount of water because they had subsided. This news really motivated a lot of people. Another big factor was really strong leadership at all levels. Governor Jerry Brown, whether you liked him or not, really grabbed onto this and pushed it very hard. And importantly, he had advisors, both in the community and in the state agency staff, that were feeding him the right information and insights. And that included environmental organizations. It included farming enterprises. And, a third thing that kind of reemphasizes one of my other point is that there were voices from different sectors saying aligned things.
Mm-hmm.
While the environmental community was saying, the Nature Conservancy, the Environmental Defense Fund among them was saying, we need to more thoughtfully do our groundwater management, and it probably needs to be locally driven. The Association of California Water Agencies put together a very well-timed report that basically represented most of the larger water purveyors, both agricultural and municipal in the state. And they said, give us local control. Don't tell us what to do. Give us local control, and we will address the groundwater issue. And so there was enough alignment among the different voices to really give a central piece of direction to a very willing leadership in the state. And with respect to New Mexico goes, I'll have to say I've been very impressed with the current leadership in key positions in the state, and I think we have some leading voices among the state agency folks who know what's going on and have a pretty clear-eyed view of what needs to happen. And I think we have people we can work with there.
Thank you so much. Do you have any examples of in New Mexico examples of building capacity of citizens or local regions or levels that could be on planning councils?
I'm not exactly sure how to get at the planning council's part of that question, but I've talked a fair bit about California in some version of my presentations. I have pieces from other states, and I think the lesson coming from Arizona at the moment is really valuable. Arizona just quickly has a few areas of the state that have been designated groundwater management areas that are where there's active management going on, but most of the state of Arizona is a wild, wild west with respect to groundwater. And there is an amazing core of local leaders. This is like county supervisors, leaders in local ag communities, city council members from some of the small communities that are really stepping up and saying, we need authorities of our own in these rural areas outside the big cities so that we can manage our water futures. And in that case, it's all groundwater. And that has risen from a fairly small number, a handful of thoughtful leaders who stepped up, began to make their voices heard, and with support from a wide range of sources, including some insights from Environmental Defense Fund, that has grown to a huge effort. And so there's a pretty strong drumbeat across Arizona to basically facilitate formation of local groundwater management districts, to allow and get the authorities from the state to do that, importantly, to more proactively manage their groundwater futures.
Thank you so much. Maurice Paul, it was so nice to spend the evening with you. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge. And I have just a couple of closing slides. I do want to remind everybody that this presentation, along with the slides, will be available on our website. Usually we post them Tuesday or Wednesday, the week following the presentation. We will also, since you registered for this meeting, you'll get an email with those links once they become available. So check your email if you want to re-listen to this recording. and we hope that you will. We also really hope that you will take some time to volunteer with us if you have some interest. We're looking for a secretary. We're always open to articles for our newsletter. You don't need to be a water expert. Any article about how you interact with water in your life is a great thing for us to have, and we would love to have that. Photos of the river or of how you use water are also always welcome, and we'll use them in our newsletter and on our website. For our Speakers Bureau, we have begun to create basically introductory water issues presentations. And so if you know of anyone in your community who would be interested in those presentations, please reach out to us and let us know, and we will schedule a presentation for that sector of the community. Just as this presentation is going to be posted online for you to view when it gets posted, and slides as well, we had a fabulous presentation by Nate Shakreese, the OSC General Counsel, last month on the Middle Rio Grande Compact and potential adjudication coming up in the Middle Rio Grande. His presentation was incredibly accessible around some really complex issues, and so we really, really encourage you to go and view that presentation. And I am dropping the link for that in the chat right now for you. So if you have a moment, please go view that presentation. There's really a lot to learn. Just like all of our wonderful presentations, including tonight's, there's incredible information to be had. And if you missed it, there's always, the workshops will always be posted on our website following. We don't take them down, so you can go back all the way to the beginning of our speaker series to find those. I know that people were mentioning Bruce Thompson's presentation on unconventional sources of water and why they're not really effective for New Mexico. So go look for some of those. We would be happy to have you watch them. And then I'm gonna go back to this slide, but I'm gonna let Norm speak. He had what announcement, and then we'll go to our final closing.
Thanks, Brittany. And Maurice, I want to thank you very much for a superb presentation with just wonderful insights based on your experience. We have to find the New Mexico flavor, but we need to follow your advice. And so thank you for packaging it so clearly for us. I have a special call for volunteers. And the purpose is to engage with our legislators. I recently made public comment at the organizational meeting of the Water and Natural Resources Committee, which will be holding, I think, 5 meetings across the state on water and natural resources issues. Clean water stewardship, I think, has gotten short shrift in these sessions before. They've focused on lots of other things. The key point is this one, though. After I made that public comment, which was pretty short and direct, I got a call from a legislator asking to meet with me to get further explanations. And we met for about 45 minutes. And at the end of the meeting, the legislator concluded that before they thought we were okay. But after hearing the facts, they knew that we weren't and we needed to take action. My fear is that many of the legislators who are volunteers and who do not have staff and who can't possibly keep up with all of the issues, the complex issues that we're facing, we have to encourage them to pay attention to our water resources, as Maurice just said we must. And what we need to do is urge them to learn the facts and then take votes during the 2026 legislature to implement the good laws that they've already passed. 4 of those, 3 were cited tonight. We have a law that provides for administration of water that's not really being used. We have the Water Data Act, but we're not funding the agencies that own the data and need to get their data cleaned up and put online. We're not funding them to do the work. It's extremely well organized by the Bureau of Geology, but we're not funding the agencies who own the data and need to make it available. And then, of course, the other law is the 2023 Water Security Planning Act. We'll be talking a lot about that in workshops to come. And then here's one last fact. The Bureau of Geology is an academic agency, and they report through the Department of Higher Education. That means that the executives at the Bureau of Geology and if they get the Department of Education to approve their budget, well, they're free to say what they need. On the other hand, executives in agencies that report directly to the governor, those agencies, executives are not free to say what they need. And we need to find the way that we get the real needs out on the table to have them seriously considered by our lawmakers when they convene in Santa Fe this coming January. Thank you so much for attending tonight. My announcement or last plea took us a few minutes over. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Good night. Good evening.
And I will just thank our co-sponsors, New Mexico Water Dialogue, Amigos Bravos, 350 New Mexico, Interfaith Power and Light, and the League of Women Voters. And if you appreciate what we do with these workshops, we would love it if you are able to donate. I'm going to put a link to donate in the chat. And if you're feeling especially generous, if you donate more than $75 or more, you will get a set of these lovely watercolor cards that are created by local artist Heather Gom. So we love to do this for you. We can only do this with your support as we are an all volunteer organization. So come volunteer with us. And if you have a little bit of money to donate, we would always appreciate that. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. We love having you here. We love being able to do these presentations for you and with you. If you have ideas of presentations you would like for us to do in the future, we're always open to hearing those as well, and we will make that happen. Have a great rest of your evening.